You're listening to Tara Lynn's A Geek Saga podcast. This episode features audio from a discussion panel that was recorded at DragonCon 2018.
So, some housekeeping things. We have a charity, DragonCon is a charity, and we would love for you to give your offerings and donations and tithes. That's right. We might pass the plate today, but it's up here, and it's a noble thing, especially for those of us who are deeply steeped in literature, as well as in all things geeky media, because it's for literacy. It's a literacy project, so it's a worthwhile cause. So we'd love you to donate to that. So this is religion and high fantasy. We thought about politics and presidential administration and high fantasy. We thought about taxes and high fantasy. But we went with religion because it was a lot calmer.
What happened to sex?
Sex, I assure you, there's plenty of that.
That's for after hours.
So, I'm going to introduce let our panelists introduce themselves here within a second, but I want to help them by taking a quick poll. And I am, in my real world life, a consultant, which means I love 2x2 matrices. It's easy to split people into. So here's my question. I want you to think about two questions. One is your degree of religious inclination, your individual kind of personal engagement. And we're not trying to pin it down to a particular faith or creed, but just your zeal for it. Because so some of you may be at the skeptical, at best end of that scale. You may even be further left on that scale, or all the way to a strongly devout person in whatever expression of faith you have. So I'm assuming that there's a span in the room for that. The second question I've got is, some of you may have different degrees of appetite for religion in your fiction, including in your fantasy. So I will assume that that's on a scale of avoid it, I don't like that when you do it to me, all the way up to, amen, brother and sister, well, let's give me some more of that, whatever that is in your version. So are you with me on that? Mm-hmm. Now, because Tara Lynn was on our panel, I chose some Game of Thrones icons, because she's a Game of Thrones geek. And so if you are at the high end of both scales, I'm going to call you a Melisandre. do we have any Melisandres in the room? If you would identify yourself. Okay, good. Now, at the other extreme, we're going to call you the Sandor Clegane. Okay? And do we have any of those skeptical and tend to avoid, although Tara may tell us, there's some transition in the development even in the city with Sandor. So it may be unfair to label him as such. Any Sandors in the room? Kind of at the low end of the quadrant for each. Well, you're welcome. On the, let's see, where do they go next? Oh, we're going to call the ones that are devout but don't like it in their fiction, I'm going to call you high sparrows. We love religion, but we like it our way. And we're just going to have it that way. Any high sparrows in the room? Not too many. You can confess. There's no shame. All right, and then in the top quadrant, we'll have the Tyrion Lannisters. I'm skeptical, but hey, this Daenerys is looking more compelling every day. So any Tyrions in the room? So did you watch how there were hands at every quadrant? You may be just in the muddled middle. I don't think I have a muddled middle yet. So, I'll talk about this when we get to our ground rules. But first, it's just to recognize there are a lot of points of view. And religion can be a flashpoint topic for a lot of people. So we're going to try to be friendly with it. Okay? So here's our panelists. Kirsten, Cairns, I called her a Tolkienian diva. Do you want to say anything about yourself?
Yes, actually. Yes.
In the context of why you chose to be on a religion and high fantasy panel.
Oh, wow, in that context. I like the Tolkien diva. I'm definitely a diva. As my little name tag here tells you, I am a staffer at theonering.net, which you may already know that. My name at The One Ring is Green Dragon. I'm also shamelessly promoting the t-shirts we have at the OneRing.net's booth. And we hope you'll come by and visit us in the Hyatt at our booth. Where am I? I would say I'm fascinated by religion in literature because in my personal life I'm a deeply spiritual person, but I really am not sure quite what I believe. So I'm always fascinated by what other people believe, the kind of anthropological side of things and the sociological side of things. What makes you tick? Why do you believe that? Tell me about your faith. And so when I encounter it in literature, I have the same reaction. I want to know more. Where are you coming from with that belief?
Good. We'll hear more from Kirsten. It's unavoidable. Tim Powers is an author, and he's an author that integrates religion into your works.
And done what?
So you put religion things into your works.
Yeah, it's
So if you
one of
want
the colors on one's palette.
talking to the microphone.
Well, yeah, since I write fantasy, which obviously involves the supernatural, it would seem an arbitrary restriction to say, but no religion. And personally, I'm practicing a very orthodox Roman Catholic.
Okay.
Not a recovering or lapsed one.
So kind of Tolkien. Okay. Tara Lynn on the end is, again, as I said, our resident Game of Thrones expert, possibly, I said, a Westerosi child of the forest. I haven't seen that cosplay yet, but
Not yet.
not yet. So, Tara.
My name is Tara. I can be found across the web at a Geek Saga. I run Ice and Fire Con, which is the first ever Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire convention in the U.S. And I wanted to be on this panel because, to be honest, I was raised in a very religious home, and I actually studied it a lot. I read the Bible like 3 times before I even graduated high school, like cover to cover. And then I got out of the house and went to college and became an entirely different person in terms of how I look at religion and whatnot. And I think that having that background and then also having that sort of my own like personal growth and kind of big leap away from any sort of faith like that, it makes me really enjoy kind of looking into how authors, put their own beliefs or even disbeliefs into their works.
Okay. Next is Constance Wagner. I called her a numinous professor. She thinks about the sacramental a lot and is a professor at St. Peter's University. Is that Jesuit?
Yeah, Jesuit University. It's Jesuit University of New Jersey. That's our kind of thing. And I wanted to be on this panel. I thought it would be interesting to talk about the concept of grace, among other things, which is part of the Jesuit tradition. And there's some other things I want to bring up, but I'm not going to do that part just now. But if you're asking for please, I was raised Roman Catholic, and I'm also open to lots of other things. So I'm an eclectic Catholic. And a believer, so okay.
And I'm Jim Wert, your simple moderator. I will confess to being a rather Orthodox Presbyterian, which is a blessing and a curse. If you're a Presbyterian, you know that I had no choice of being on this panel. In a nutshell. I'm going to talk about some quick ground rules for us and a summary of it. So, as I said earlier when we did a little poll, just respect the diversity in the room. We're hoping for an interactive panel. We'll hopefully have a lot of discussion up here, but we have some traveling microphones around the room. It's a crowded room, which is great, but it may be a little tough for us to get to a microphone. But if you wait for it, or if you've got a big booming voice, but as you do that, please respect the fact that there are people with diverse opinions, and we only have 45 minutes now, 40, 50 minutes. We're not going to solve them all. Okay? So just be friendly. Debate ideas, not so much individuals. So in other words, and I hope we'll get to big ideas, but no, what an idiotic thing for you to say. talk
Jim.
about Jim. Yeah. So the idea is not in those, and keep it friendly. Just keep it friendly. Focus on high fantasy content, not conversions. We're not here to convert you to our particular way of thinking about things. And as you can see, even on our panel, we have a broad cross section. We had an Inklings panel yesterday, and they had a broad cross section, and they figured it out. So hopefully we can figure it out. Or more simply, in the big, any volunteers on the staff, DragonCon volunteers on other staffs, you know what our big DragonCon rule is? One thing, don't be a jerk. Don't be a jerk. Don't be a jerk. So in other words, and I don't know if you want to has this, so it's more like this, coexist.
Yes.
It's our Tolkienian version of it, not this. Because that's true, I'm a large fan.
And as luck would have it, we do still have some of those Coexist t-shirts for sale at the OneRing.net booth. So if you'd like a Coexist shirt, come on by and see us there. Did I mention that already?
I also just wanted to mention that in a cab on the way to the con the other day, when I told the driver where I was going and why, he said, "Oh, that's that thing where all the people gather together and worship the devil." So, welcome.
Was that last night? I missed that.
I'm going to try to give you some really quick context so that we just lay a little bit of groundwork here, and then we're going to release our panelists to various things. But just some context. And we probably can't read this, so I'm going to read this out to you. Just like Tim said, if you're going to write in a fantasy world, it would be an unnatural constraint to remove the religious element from it. And so, in one argument is our desire to answer the big questions, whatever your big questions are. What about death? Where are we going with God? Where did this all come from? Why am I here? Now, those are nearly universal kinds of questions. So it makes sense for fiction generally and fantasy in particular to try to answer those kinds of questions. So faith, myth, God, gods, worship, etc. have been part of that quest for meaning and for answers for millennia. Some see that quest as delusion or distraction. And that may be some of our Sandor, Clegane, and corner of it. Which, okay, some see that as, even asking the question as itself evidence of a reality beyond that which we merely experience. So there are an array of points of view. Our focus in this panel is primarily how do these urges and questions and treatments and artistic expression show up in the themes that are explored, particularly in fantasy. And our focus is not going to be trying to settle all those big questions, unless our panelists have a breakthrough. The last thing I'll say is we also understand a lot of the fantasy that we're consuming at DragonCon is mostly Western fantasy. It's not exclusively so, and there are other tracks that look at, I think is there still a Silk Road track?
Yes.
So it's looking at Asian components, and obviously there are a lot of Asian religious and myth kinds of treatments but we're mostly looking at the Western culture and worldview, and that means a lot of what we are dealing with is connected to Christianity. And if you were here at the last panel or the Beowulf concentrated panels, you heard some of that come out as well. It's the backdrop. We're not trying to be intentionally jingoistic or narrow. It's just where we are going primarily with this panel. So just want to set that expectation. There are lots of paths into religion in high fantasy. So I'm going to give you just 4 broad examples. We may get into some others. Sometimes religion is overt, almost to the point of being allegorical. Obviously, the Narnia Chronicles in C.S. Lewis is an example of that. If you are a Madeleine L'Engle fan, she is a devoutly Christian person, and those kinds of things will appear, not quite as overtly perhaps as in Narnia. So that's one kind of an approach. It's right there on the surface and you can see it. And there's a particular point of view that's being expressed. In other cases, it's deeply embedded into the fabric of the story. And so if you've been to any of our Beowulf panels, you've heard about how the author of Beowulf was most likely a Christian, and Kirsten can talk about that. But that's also clearly the case with Tolkien and all of his legendarium, and our Roman Catholics may end up helping us with that. In contrast to that, there are also clear examples that are counter-religious. And so, and that a classic example would be Philip Pullman. So much so that I even put a quote on the bottom of that page. It says, "I'm a religious person, although I am not a believer." Which is an interesting thing for a Philip Pullman to say. You know, he is integrating points of view about religion into his works, but from his perspective, which in some interpretations is running as a counter literature to what Lewis was doing in Narnia. And so you may love the Golden Compass, you may not. But that was clearly what he was doing. If you're an Ursula Le Guin fan, and I actually read an article in preparation in a Christian periodical that was talking about the value of Ursula Le Guin's approach to thinking about themes like death and what happens afterward, although she would have described herself as a non-religious person. So, and then Tara can help us, because if, maybe it's just ambiguous. There's a smorgasbord to choose from that has presented itself in various ways, and it's either uncertain or interesting or good fiction, or it's about power, but whatever it is, it may just be confusing to us. So there are those kinds of books and fantasies that we know about. So here, I'm gonna put all of 4 of my themes up here. I got 4 panels. I kind of divvy them up with them. But honestly, I think it's going to end up just mixing all up. So we may have you kick off, and I'll try to watch the clock and hit some spots. But here are some discussion themes. Why the connection? How and why is fantasy an effective genre? An effective genre, just not an inevitable, an effective genre for religious themes. And we'll ask Tim in particular to kind of kick us off there. Second, what are the main and best religious themes that fantasy tends to tackle? And Kirsten may help us get that conversation started. Who does it well? Who does it not so well? Who's horrible at it, if you want to go there? And what are the reasons? What do you look for when religion is dealt with appropriately or not so much? And then what are some common or best approaches or even tropes for integrating fantasy into, or religion into your fantasy? And as a writer, Constance may help us with that. So those questions make sense, maybe, we kind of distributed them out. So actually, Tim, why don't we start and just, you help us get going, and then we'll go wherever. But why the connection? What is it about fantasy that makes it a vehicle for religious thought and exploration?
Oh, well, as I said earlier, fantasy by definition deals with the supernatural. You've got ghosts, etc. And ultimately, I think it really is rooted in mythology, largely because the old mythology stories have proven to be so enduring and universal, even among cultures that can't have had contact with one another, that you do start to believe the Jungian idea that these figures and situations are wired into the very basements of every human mind. And of course they show up, as I say, in mythology. They show up in all sorts of places. And so, given that you're writing about magic, supernatural, I think for one thing, people are going to be worshiping stuff. Even if you have, some sort of fringy offshoot crowd. We've seen it in a lot of fantasy stories where that tribe worships Dingo, the frog god. In the Fritz Leiber, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories, there's lots of remember, there's the street of the gods. Every building is a different god. I think it does lead you, just as in physics, the evidences all, if you trace them down, lead you ultimately to the idea of the Big Bang. I think if you admit the possibility of the supernatural in all its various manifestations, it will lead you back to an equivalent Big Bang, that such a thing is implied. Now, certainly in fiction, it needn't and arguably oughtn't to be overt. As I said, I'm practicing Catholic, but the supernatural in my books is, I don't know, ancient Greek gods, ghosts, vampires. I certainly would never in my books attempt to proselytize. Some people can do that effectively. You think of, well, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, in a broader sphere, George Orwell. But I find as a reader myself, if I see the writer trying to advance a position on me under the guise of fiction, my credulity snaps. Make it implicit at most. Anyway, ultimately, yeah, I do think the facts of supernatural in fiction implies that you could refine it down to an ultimate Big Bang, which would be God.
Okay. Let's look that up with the other panelists first. Then
Just one of the things I think is interesting about kind of why literature would deal with religion or how effectively it deals with it, it seems to me, and this is kind of picking up on something that Tim was saying, it's inevitable that we as human beings would express and seek to express ourselves in that way. And there's kind of two sides to that coin. On the one hand, part of the human condition is that we're always trying to understand our place in the world. We've always tried to say, why does the sun appear to come up in the morning? Why does it appear to go down at night? Why does it cross the sky? What's going on there? We try to explain it, and as science it develops and grows, then we have scientific explanations, but we're always trying to make sense of the things around us and then say, well, what does it mean that we're going to die? So as humans, we're always trying to make sense of those things, and art is a way that we express our endeavors to make sense of those things, and religion is another way that we try to make sense of those things. So on the one side of the coin, you've got this inevitability that our art would also express our religion, because they're both kind of serving the same purpose of saying, what are we doing here? What's our place in the world? The other side of that coin is the Tolkien and Lewis side, that the reason we are creative and questioning and thinking and wondering is because God created us that way, that our own imagination is evidence of the divine creator, that we are able to be sub-creators, that we have these imaginative powers. I'm very much shorthanding that, but that would be the sort of Tolkien-Lewis argument. So it's absolutely inevitable that both our nature as humans means we want to seek out religion, and we use art as a way of doing that, or perhaps because there is a God, that is our nature as humans, and therefore that means that religion exists.
Okay, I can actually add to that. My basic philosophy is, and it ties in with what Kirsten just said, that art is the song of the soul. That is how we express ourselves to each other, and it doesn't matter what nationality, etc. We do it through storytelling, through music, etc. And for many people, the artistic expression becomes the religious experience. For the creator of the art and the receivers of the art, the audience, you find an intensity of emotion, an attraction to the ideals that are phrased in a way that, because we're also wired to want story, this is why people do Bible study. I mean, they read the Bible, and anything else, any kind of religious, just when you're offered an example, parables and whatnot, storytelling helps tune into what you need. But our art itself it really is a religious experience for those creating it, those receiving it, and it helps us understand more of our own spirituality, I think.
Constance has been working on her book for the last 27 years and has never once used the Lord's name in vain in that religious experience.
I'm not. No.
Tara, anything you want to...
Well, I mean, just the point that I think whether you're doing it consciously or subconsciously, unconsciously, your beliefs are always going to make your deepest beliefs are always going to show at some point in your work.
Well, true.
So.
We'll maybe take a question or two on this one, and then we're going to move on to the second question. See this hand over here.
Talk really loud.
Yeah, it's coming.
Thank you. If you're developing a religion from scratch that's not centered to the plot of the story, but integral to the characters, personalities, behavior, and faith she expresses, to avoid the world builder's demise, how far into the dogma should you plan out and conceive
Can I hold that question?
Sure.
We're going to get there, but that's going to go to the how do you do it. So when we get to the how do you do it part,
I wanted to answer that.
that question. Let's go with
What I find interesting is the compare and contrast. George Martin is very deep, all these different religious sects, with Tolkien, and even though he was deeply Catholic, there's no religious groups within The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. Can you compare and contrast that a minute?
Yeah, and so you can go, for example, Tara got us into this. She said that your beliefs are going to come out somehow. Martin would describe himself as, I don't know, a lapsed Catholic? A recovering agnostic. He's kind of a little ambiguous.
I like to think it's like a virus. You might be in remission for decades, but one morning you wake up and it's all over you again.
It's a skittle disease.
Martin went to a high school that was very near where I work, and it was Catholic Marist Brothers High School, and he came out of there absolutely hating everything about religion.
Yeah.
So then a question for Tara maybe to start. What's he trying to say, do you think?
I mean, I don't know if with his religion specifically, he's trying to make some sort of deeper statement than what is it's kind of like there. It jumps out at you like from the page that the true religion in his world, I think, is nature. But he writes, the faith of the seven, which was inspired by the structure of the medieval Catholic Church, and he's got the old gods, which are kind of like Celtic animism inspired, and then the rulerism is it's like this mystery cult that is based on like some say the Cathars or Albigensians. There's a couple other ones that I've never heard of that somebody else mentioned, but I think generally it's the Cathars or Albigensians. But it also has. I also always think that rulerism has some kind of similarities to those fun like corner protesters we see at all these conventions, because they literally do that in his world. So yeah, I think he's putting these religions out there for us just to kind of show like the cruelty of blind faith, regardless of which one somebody's following.
Okay, yeah, so sometimes religion is in there to have a commentary on the nature of religion itself. Interesting.
Almost inevitably.
Yeah. Which is a good segue here to the second kind of broad set of themes, which are core religious themes. Pay no attention. So some core religious themes, and I'll just toss out a lot, and then you can go wherever you want. Kirsten's going to go around this. So origins and creation, some up and some down kinds of things. The struggle between and the definition of good and evil. Death and what happens after. Free will versus fate. Presbyterians are right. Redemption, sacrifice, salvation. Yeah, I could do that. Virtue and heroism, temptation and moral ambiguity, just the nature of hope, so those kinds of things. And you guys, okay, so it's like, but you don't have to limit yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, well,
I did send you a copy before.
no, you did. It's all good. So some of the themes, man, we could go on about this forever, but I won't. I was saying yesterday in our Beowulf panel that religion, I find, often will reflect. It can be a bit of a zeitgeist. So the author in the aspects of religion that they bring out in their book is often reflecting something about how religion is in society at that time, or perhaps trying to influence something about how that author believes religion should be in society at that time. So, for example, in Beowulf, this is a author writing, a poet writing from a Christian perspective, writing about a pagan people, pre-Christian peoples, but telling the story with the viewpoint that even though they didn't know the Christian God, he was overseeing it all. Because if you believe that is the God, then that God has been God even when people didn't believe that God was God. So Beowulf is telling a story of pre-Christian times from a Christian slant, and kind of taking ownership of the Anglo-Saxon world picture of the importance of the hero, and turning that into a Christian perspective. You don't see it as overtly in Beowulf as you find it elsewhere in Anglo-Saxon literature and particularly art, but this idea that Christ is the warrior hero who mounts the cross in glory. He's not nailed to it in agony, he's choosing to climb up there and be victorious over death. So he becomes a figure who would be immediately recognizable and appealing to people in this Anglo-Saxon warrior heroic society. Once you get into the Renaissance period and things happen like the Black Death, suffering, pain, not that that wasn't going on in Anglo-Saxon times, but in Renaissance writings you get much more of this sense of why are we suffering on this earth? And so the Christ figure becomes the suffering king, the one who lays himself down, doesn't climb up in glory, he lays himself down to suffer. And in Tolkien and Lewis, and again it's very shorthanding this, they're exploring a religion at a time in the 20th century when, except for a sort of resurgence a little bit during the Second World War, they're seeing a period where people are becoming much more doubting about religion. The attendance in church through the 20th century is just dropping off, and they are therefore perhaps doing different things with their writing about religion to try and remind people of the relevance that they believe that faith has at their time. So it's often, as I say, a zeitgeist that's an important reflection of the time. Some of these particular topics, just going through them and then we can see what others have to throw in there. Origins and creation, well, that of course makes me think of Norse mythology and therefore Tolkien, right? That leads us on to his idea of sub-creation, that if, as an artist, you want to build a world or create a religion, all you're ever doing is being a sub-creator, because your imagination, your art comes from the creator, God. And so through the very act of writing, you're kind of exploring your origins. But Tolkien's great exploring origins and creation, although it doesn't seem like he's exploring our origins or the creation of our planet, but he's finding his own way of expressing that. Good and evil makes me think, of course, of Arthurian literature, the Grail quest literature. You very much see that sense of looking for an object which could solve all and cure all, but in Charles Williams' writings, the Grail becomes something in the wrong hands, like in Indiana Jones, could be a source of evil. So it's got to be in the right hands to be a relic for good. I also think good and evil is very interesting in Martin in Game of Thrones, because he blurs them so much. He's so great at setting up characters that we're like, yes, this character is an evil character. And then we're like, but I really like him. And I find myself going, but Jamie Lannister, I kind of love him, he's kind of great, and he hasn't really done anything wrong. And then my friend says, well, he did rape someone, and he did push a little boy off a wall to his death. I'm like, yeah, but he's not all bad. And I think, interestingly, Martin does that with how he writes about religion as well. And Tara was saying that he's kind of exploring how religion can be corrupted. It can be good and evil. And the big question mark I have with Martin's depictions of religion is, why the worshippers of R'hllor seem to have so much power. Because most of the religions that we see, it's like, well, people believe this, but it doesn't actually protect them, it doesn't save them, it doesn't help them, they believe it, but where is their God when shit is going down, right? But the Lord of Light keeps getting involved. What's that about? Why this religion that sees evil seems to be the one that has the power maybe to overcome the White Walkers eventually? We don't know. So, death and afterlife, let me just throw out here a little tiny fantasy that doesn't talk about religion really at all, except Harry Potter. What is going on the train platform? That wonderful little moment of death and afterlife, this little glimpse that Harry goes to some kind of purgatory, landing halfway up the stairs place, where he meets Dumbledore and basically gets to choose. Do you want to take a train on, or do you want to go back? So there's this just fascinating little glimpse of maybe what something of the afterlife might be. That's so unusual to me that Rowling threw that in there, because that's not something she deals with otherwise. Free will versus fate. Beowulf is all about free will and fate, but they're not versus each other. According to Beowulf, you have free will and fate at the same time. And Lewis wrote about this, and particularly in the Screwtape Letters. There's a wonderful one where Screwtape tells Wormwood that because God doesn't work in linear time, he knows what we are going to choose, because it's all happening at the same time for God. It's not linear. So if they say, well, this happened because God knew that was going to happen, and someone would say, well, that meant you didn't have a choice. No, God knew you were going to choose that. You had a choice, and when it came to that moment as we linearly live through time, you had a choice, but God already knew you were going to make the choice you made. So you're both kind of fated in the way that we understand it, because God sees the whole picture before it's happened, but you still have free will. He knows what we will choose, but we still get to choose. So Lewis sort of plays very well with this thing of free will and fate. And as I say in Beowulf, all the time, it's when you're going to die, you're going to die. If it's your doom, if it's your fate, doesn't matter how great a warrior you are. If it's not your time to die, you will survive. And if it is your time to die, you're out. And then the last one I wanted to just touch on in this list, and then I'll hand it over to others, is the redemption and sacrifice one. Different kinds of sacrifice, different kinds of depictions of that. Again, going back to Anglo-Saxon writing, in the poem The Dream of the Rood, I mentioned that before, you have this sense that, yes, Christ is the sacrificial lamb, but he's more of the sacrificial warrior. So he is like Beowulf in his final encounter with the dragon, knowing that he's doomed. He senses even as he's going that this is the end, but he goes anyway, and he goes with glory and strength and power. Versus the sacrifice that we see of Aslan in the Narnia stories, where yes, he has strength and power, but when the moment of the sacrifice, we see him absolutely, supposedly weak, shorn of his mane. He very much is this meek and suffering sacrifice. Now, in both those cases, well, not Beowulf the hero, but the Christ representation, you have the rising in glory afterwards. But there's that different depiction of what kind of sacrifice do we need? Do we need the sacrifice that goes as the bold warrior into the battle, or do we need the sacrifice who allows himself to be led forward, tied and bound and meek? And I don't know what our current society, we need something, but I don't know what kind of sacrifice we need right now.
So let me ask Constance and Tim, as authors, what are the themes that you find yourself either going to intentionally or find yourself wandering into? Are there any you try to avoid?
I don't go into any intentionally. In fact, I never have any sort of something to say when I write a story. This is my statement on this issue. I never do that. As Tara was saying, if you do write fiction simply caring about the story and the characters and reread it, if you have done enough of it, it will be evident a lot of what you think. Theodore Sturgeon once said that if you have convictions, simply write about interesting characters with interesting problems, and your beliefs will be as evident as a Volkswagen under a tarp. So I never set out with I'm going to educate the reader or improve the reader or corrupt the reader, or that's because I certainly hate it as a reader when writers attempt that kind of thing. Inevitably, my ideas of what is interesting stories and interesting supernatural situations is probably derived from my Catholic beliefs, though they are also probably derived from my fondness for Fritz Leiber, H.P. Lovecraft, A. Merritt, and pretend I went through the whole list. Some of it works backwards. I think it's easier to comprehend or in some way get your mind around certain religious beliefs if you do have a background in science fiction and fantasy. As Kirsten was saying, it's naive, though natural, to say, how can I be blamed for my actions? If God knows what I'm going to do next Tuesday, obviously I have no choice about what I'm going to do next Tuesday. I mean, he could be writing it down right now for all we know and putting it in an envelope. He'll show it to me then. But the mistake is to imagine that God foresees or remembers anything, or that the fact of him being in 2018 means he can't just as fully be in 2020 or 1900, just as being in Los Angeles, we don't believe precludes him from being in Chicago. And if you're a science fiction fantasy fan, you're a little bit more open to the idea of a perspective that is not locked into our sequential conveyor belt. And I do think that in fiction, certainly, and realistically in real life as well, we want to have characters we can admire for what they choose to do. I mean, they could have stayed home, but instead they did the admirable thing. And we want to be able to despise characters who could have behaved themselves, but instead chose to do this despicable thing. Free will, in other words. What you see in the Greek mythology really is determinism, fate. I mean, once the Delphic Oracle says what's what, you may as well just go along with it. I mean, poor old Oedipus, you know. And I do think, and as a matter of fact, Bertrand Russell would agree with me. He wrote a book called Science and Religion. And he said that if you imagine that your physical actions, what you do or choose not to do, has any causal connection with anything happening in your mind, you're deluded. Whether you choose to have a beer or a Coke, pick up the phone or let it keep ringing, is as inevitable as the course of a pebble in an avalanche. And that the idea that we have free will and that therefore we can be praised for doing the right thing or blamed for doing the wrong thing is as crazy as blaming a brick wall for falling on you. You wouldn't, arrest it and put it on trial and punish it. I wandered from your question, but I do think free will itself is very tightly bound in with what it is that we like in fantasy fiction.
Good. I want to give an open forum here, so let me kind of get through the last couple of areas quickly, and then maybe we can open up to the audience.
Sorry.
One of the things is just who does it? Who does it well? If you had to kind of recommend, given your reading, here's a book that I think actually integrates religion effectively into it for your tastes. Tara, I don't know if you have a point of view on that. Or?
I mean, to be honest, I really don't, because it depends on what somebody's looking for. Are you looking for the allegorical, like C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia? Are you looking for the almost like near lack of it? Tolkien with his. I mean, there's just pretty much no mention, or religion is definitely not a big part of their world. Or are you looking for something like Martin, where you want to see, this author's reflections of. Yeah, of so many different religions. So I really think, for me, I love Song of Ice and Fire, but so I would probably say that. But
are there others that you also like?
For religion-wise, honestly, I don't really look for that in my stories. So if it's there and it's done well, then it's kind of, that's great, but it's definitely not something that I go searching for.
Yeah.
I have a book that I would love to mention that just kind of as one to recommend. It's actually a children's book, or a young adult book, by an author called Margaret Mahy, and the book is called Changeover. And it's not at all what you would expect that we're talking about here for religion, but it reflects very well beliefs of pagan and Wiccan religions. So it's just a fantastic story, and to me it's a very good exploration of what in some pagan pathways is believed. So I'm just going to throw that out there. Margaret Mahy's Changeover is a great book.
I think it's kind of interesting in that you're asking for some books to recommend, but I think another way to look at this is like those of us who are deep into different fandoms will reread works. Certainly I reread Tolkien, etc. But I also want to mention the idea, for example, if you've read Harry Potter, who has not read Harry Potter, okay, and even The Hunger Games, these are books about sacrifice, right? And so if you go back to read it, just read past the story, and you start looking for thematic content and see how well is that handled. So the question of sacrifice, is somebody volunteering to actually do the hard thing, and people who choose not to do the hard thing, and you start to explore. Somebody in the last panel asked me, how do you get involved in literary criticism? This is how you do it. You start rereading what you already know, and then you look at it with a different eye. Now, the idea, the question of grace is a big one, that you're given efficacious grace. Karl Rahner is a Jesuit scholar who actually did a treatise on this. He is the man to go to in the 20th century for concepts on grace. And that is permeated through the Lord of the Rings constantly, that each character is given just what he or she would need to accomplish in order to bring that choice, that moment to fruition. I think that the stories that deal with sacrifice and people rising above their own limitations to fulfill something, that's inspirational. And I was talking about when I said before about art being the song of the soul. This is why these things resonate with us, because it is touching something that is inherently human, but also rises for that numinous quality, to rise above everyday experience and see that we are part of the fabric of the universe. So this is how you have to look at that, I think. So, yeah.
Good. I'm going to transition and finally get back to your question. But the one thing that the book I would toss on here, and I put it in the little graphic, was Lewis, but his Till We Have Faces. It was one of his last books that he wrote. I think it's actually, for me personally, one of his best crafted books. Lewis, from his immediate circle, got lots of criticism about ripping them off too quickly. But I think he really worked this one, and it deals with myth, the psyche myth. And it's really well done. And if you don't like Lewis because he has too much religion, read this book. If you do like Lewis because he has a lot of religion, read this book. So it's good. So the question, and this will be our bridge to the general opening floor. So you were asking, how do you do it? There's a particular example that you had in mind. And so what are the approaches, tropes to avoid, things that work well? So things like a quest, and myth, and sub-religions, and magic, and Christ figures, and morally ambiguous characters, and those kinds of things. So I'll just open it to the panel. Constance, if you want to open it, but did that get your question kind of? Yeah.
How much dogma do you need? That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, how much dogma? Yeah.
You don't. I mean, I think that Tolkien proved that. And this one, I actually going to a different segue. If you're looking at George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan. Now, St. Joan was a living, breathing human being, okay? But when you see the play about her that Shaw did, they have this whole discussion about illusion versus reality. It's really interesting where you deal with Joan is a sacrificial figure. So this is a fictional representation of Joan of Arc, but she is ultimately a wonderful example of sacrifice. And he's not beating you over the head with belief. She's the one who believes. Everybody that's around her, even the scions of the church, they're simply like people. There's the government, there's the bishops, etc. And it's then it's business as usual. They're not very religious, and she's the only person who carried that religiosity forward, I think. So it's an interesting way to explore if you look at drama too, and I think that St. Joan is an excellent character and historical person to explore that further.
Good. Why don't we open the floor?
Okay.
And I see a hand over there, and if anybody on the staff, we could even turn up the lights now, because we're just going to go to the Q&A.
Yeah, true.
In the,
I
Stuck
just want to
in.
just touch back on the how much, because I feel like we haven't really addressed your question there. And whilst I am not a published writer, I certainly have written things, but also from reading, my feeling is you need as much in there as is necessary for your audience to understand your character's motivations. So if you're creating a religion, like all different Martin's different ones, etc., you do not want to bog your reader down with facts about, on the second Tuesday of every month they are required to, unless that's relevant to the plot. So I think you have to have sort of a pretty good outline in your own mind, but it's the relevance of that religion that you're creating is how does it drive your characters, how does it motivate them, and if there's a piece of dogma of your created faith that is going to be significant to their motivators, you've got to be sure your readers know what that is.
Doom is a good example of that. The
Doom,
first three
yeah.
books, Doom.
yeah, by the way, High Fantasy yesterday officially declared a hostile takeover of the Star Wars universe. Apparently, we've also taken
It's
over.
mine now.
So we've got Harry Potter, we're taking over Doom. So sooner or later, and in your comments, we would really appreciate it if you please ask for a bigger room. That way we can incorporate all of these fandoms. All your bases on the line.
Come to the website, we have everything.
And partly in answer to your question, certainly the details and dogmas and doctrines and everything, rituals, traditions of your religion being a part of this created background. You're not setting this in New York today. Just as you're going to need to know more about the economy, the weather, agriculture, than you will bother to show the reader. You need to know much more about the background than the reader will ever know, so that the bits you show us will be evidently consistent. I would say, yeah, you better know a lot about the damn religion. You won't show us nearly a substantial fraction of how much you know about it, but you better know about it. Just as you had better know the entire life of your character up to the point where we begin to see him. And just as you need to make your economy consistent with your technology and your agriculture, you don't want to have tomatoes in winter in the wrong climate. You'd better work to make your fictional religion something that intelligent people will find plausible. Intelligent people will find plausible in its explanation of conscience, death, etc. And it's interesting when you see religions, fictional religions, where the author did appear to give it more construction than perhaps was demanded. I think mainly not a fantasy, but Philip K. Dick's A Maze of Death. Has anybody read A Maze of Death, Philip K. Dick? Come on, get busy. In any case, for this science fiction novel, he did invent an entirely fictitious religion which undertook to explain everything.
So let's go over here. We got a question.
Sort of going off of that, and maybe this is just an agnostic's dilemma, but the difference when you write a fictional world and create religions in it, you as the author and then we as the reader have the opportunity to see maybe the objective truth of it that you can't, I mean, some would argue you could, but I, from my perspective, would say you cannot see in real religions. For example, in Song of Ice and Fire, we see examples of Roller's magic, we see examples of the weirwoods and the old gods, we see maybe even a little bit of an example of the drowned gods' validity, whereas I can't think of any instances that says, like, yes, the faith of the seven totally exist as supernatural beings, which to me suggests that they don't. So how does that work in, I guess, you can create religions as objective truth in a fiction the way they maybe aren't in reality, even if people feel they are. You can't kind of project that. You can think someone's wrong, you can maybe say they're wrong, but you can't like forcibly make them believe they're wrong, whereas in fictional characters, we can, as readers or a person as a writer, can know that the religion is right or wrong. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, you are, but I would say, or can we? Because we only know what Martin is choosing to tell us, right? So if we take the whole sub-creation thing a little further. So the characters peopling Martin's books don't necessarily know that what they're experiencing is that something just happened. And we're told, we see, because we have the omniscient view, that that this is because this happened, or that it's because Melisandre did this, but we don't know that for sure. And you could argue that in our day-to-day life, stuff happens all the time that might be happening because of this, and if we have a certain belief or we experience something in a certain way, then we say, oh, now that's a revelation to me. So I think actually we're told something when we're reading literature sometimes, which is didactically saying it happened for this, but whether we really accept that or believe that as truth is the same experience that we have in the real world. It's like, what has been revealed to us? Has the writer revealed it to us, and therefore we accept it as truth? But if it's revealed to us through our emotions in the real world, why don't we accept that as truth too? And that was one of the things that Lewis sort of grappled with and then came to terms with in his own belief system, was this idea, and again it's mentioned in Screwtape Letters, that we tend to be ready to accept bad things and the way they make us feel as absolutely real, and good things and the way they make us feel as just being transitory. And so I have such joy today, but that's just a feeling, not anything real. But I'm terrified of whatever it is going on that plane on Thursday, and that's real fear. Well, they're all real and just feelings in the same way. So I think things are revealed or not revealed in this world as they are in literature. We just buy into them in different ways because we're ready to believe the author.
Let's see if we can get one more question over here at least, maybe a couple more.
Hi there. I could talk about this stuff all day, honestly, but the one question that I had was, and this may just be based on like the kinds of books that I read, but I encounter polytheistic kind of fictional religions more so than monotheistic ones. Why do you think that is, and do you think that affects the kinds of themes that come up in those books? Interesting.
So polytheism, we can see some of that peeking out. We'll talk about that in the hour, but another panel coming up.
Yeah.
Polytheism, monotheism.
Well, I mean, I think that the one thing about monotheism is that it's I think it just is always just going to tend to be almost too real, which is why it's easier for writers to create polytheistic religions. In fantasy, maybe easy isn't even the right word, but it's better for them to do so, because by trying to write a monotheistic one, it might just be too close to what, a huge portion of the world practices in real life, and then it takes you out of their fantasy world.
Of course, that's very much from a Western sort of Christian perspective, because if we were living in India, we would be much more ready, perhaps, to believe a polytheistic worldview.
We're going to have one more question. We're distributing those questions. Go ahead.
So, just for the sake of time, there's a complicated dynamic between authors who choose to express and amplify ethical or religious themes through the POV of fantastic worlds and characters like witches who have been historically condemned through the Western Christian lens and still are today. Speaking as someone who was raised in a Roman Catholic school but discovered her relationship to the world through fantasy literature, I would love to hear your personal and professional points of view of how you navigate something like that.
Well, that's a great question.
Okay, that is an excellent question. My background's probably very similar to yours, you know, and as I said before, I'm still a practicing Roman Catholic, but I have also the eclecticism, you know, I'm open to different things. I think that being aware of different beliefs, and I mean, you mentioned witches and whatnot, or the pagan stipulations, it opens up a whole realm of possibilities of how to interpret the world, you know, and it filters through into your art. And it doesn't mean that you abandon any kind of faith that you were raised with, it simply means that you're able to see manifestations in different ways, you know, and so it can come into your art, and some people will also choose to practice if they want to do that, but we're really rather interesting, and then I find that studying various things also is preferred to my literature and the Celtic stuff that I'm interested in, and the Arthurian stuff that I'm interested in, obviously, the Tolkien, etc. But yeah, it really, I mean, one of the 9,000 projects that I'm still working to finish is I'm doing a play on St. Joan, you know, so it's like this, but that's fascinating to me, you know, a chosen figure for sacrifice and whatnot, but I also see, and I have a Celtic novel as well, so, you know, yeah. So it just influences different ways, and it doesn't make you abandon things of your childhood. It's still good in a different way.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or final thoughts from our panelists?
Final thoughts.
No final thoughts. Well, please look for Tim's next book, The Tomato and Orchard.
Thank you for listening to Tara Lynn's A Geek Saga podcast. If you like what you heard, please check out my website, ageeksaga.com, or consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/ageeksaga.